and pleased that we have Gary Lux with us today. He's a new member, or his company is a new member of Bay Planning Coalition. He's with ERM, Environmental Resource Management, and he's going to be giving us some remarks regarding federal and state regulations and how they're affecting the maritime industry. So Gary.
All right, the noise has died down, at least for a moment. I sure hope it subsides. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you some thoughts regarding legislative and regulatory developments on this side of the country in California. I think dysfunction in the political environment really knows no bounds, and even though there's a lot of dysfunction in DC, even with the democratically controlled upper and lower house in Sacramento with a Democratic governor, there's quite a bit of dysfunction in the Capitol as well. And one of those reasons, of course, is because of the need for a supermajority to pass a budget. And so that has been the cloud that has been hanging over legislative policy in Sacramento for quite a while. Will be the same issue until November, depending on what happens with the two competing initiatives that may or may not break the logjam for managing the budget. But that does preoccupy policy in California. Nonetheless, last legislative session that concluded with the bills becoming effective last January 1st resulted in 760 bills signed by the governor, 128 vetoed bills, and a considerable number of those bills are environmental bills. Because that's really where a lot of the heavy lifting continues to be in Sacramento. Just for a moment, if we look at dysfunction and will that change, there is some prognostication about where the supermajority levels will be in Sacramento. There are some predictions that this November will end up with the Senate having 2/3 Democratic control, and then some predictions suggest that in the next couple of election cycles, the same will happen for the Assembly. And if that were to happen, we could see a shift dramatically away from the budget preoccupation and an emphasis on policy. But nonetheless, there's quite a bit of policy as well. And if you'll advance the slide, that'd be great. Here, I try to stay as current as possible, and you can't really see the top right is the article I just finished in the Environmental Law Reporter entitled The 2001 Legislative Recap, A Touch of More Green. And there is a shift in that perspective because you do have alignment with the governor and the Democratic-controlled legislature, even though it's not controlled by supermajority. Next slide, please. So the topics I want to share with you include a really high-level look at climate change and air quality and energy. Those three topics go together. They dominate policy and will dominate for years to come. There are some developments in the hazardous waste and materials area with forthcoming developments that we can expect in green chemistry this summer or fall. Water quality and water supply still get a lot of attention. The California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, sustainability, and enforcement. So I'll share some thoughts at a high level with regard to those topics. Why do we care? We're focused on the update and the horse race of what's happening and what are the new developments. I think we sometimes fail to take a look at what are the rules and requirements that govern our operations today. In my experience, very few organizations tend to focus on capturing what are the rules and requirements that apply and those that do not apply. And so why I focus on this because I feel that there's a need to not only update, but really get your hands around what the rules are, because in evaluating compliance at facilities, I often find the findings and violations occur because people were simply not doing the exercise of capturing the rule, dissecting it, and then rolling it out and penetrating the organization. So there's value in doing the horse race, which I'm going to talk about, but also quite a bit of importance that should be placed on trying to stay on top of what the rules are. Next slide, please. Disclaimer here is just that I'm scratching the surface. There is so much out there in the environmental compliance and sustainability arena at the state and federal level, as well as at the local, state and city levels as well. Next slide. So I'm going to begin by talking about the developments, the key developments that are relevant to you involving climate change. And I was prepared to talk about the district court's opinion putting the low carbon fuel standard on hold. The low carbon fuel standard is designed to decarbonize fuel by 10% by the year 2020, and the Air Resources Board had been working on regulations. The district court held that the rules would violate the Commerce Clause constitutionally, and therefore ordered an injunction, and the Air Resources Board was to await a decision. And then just yesterday or the day before, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals lifted the exemption, so ARB now has the opportunity to move forward on finalizing those low carbon fuel standards, which will affect all types of transportation, both maritime and on the land. Senate Bill 375, as many of you know, is a legacy bill that Senator Steinberg, the Senate Pro Tem, passed a few years ago. And he sees this as a legacy bill which is designed to require or incentivize the ABAG and other metropolitan planning organizations to reduce the vehicle miles traveled, which would include passenger vehicles and trucks. And ABAG came out with their plan to reduce vehicle miles traveled, and that level will be 15% reduction by the year 2035 for trucks. So drayage trucks and other trucks involved in cargo will need to reduce the number of miles traveled, and that's simply going to be addressed through land use planning and a smart growth strategy. So that is a lot of heavy lifting that's going to take a couple of decades, but it will affect everyone here in one way or another. And there's a lot of benefit in weighing in on the local decision-making process and the regional process to see how that takes shape and how that'll affect your businesses. Let's see. In the interest of time, I'm going to move to the next slide. Another climate change development involves the response to the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in the Massachusetts EPA case, which basically gave U.S. EPA authority to regulate climate change greenhouse gases within the existing authority of the Clean Air Act at the federal level. So with that, the EPA promulgated regulations, which became effective last year and continue to have an impact with some looming deadlines that, for the most part, require that large sources, known as major sources, of 100,000 tons per year of greenhouse gases need to abide by the best available control technology control for new source review permitting, as well as Title V operating permits. So some facilities that were able to skirt or avoid Title V air permitting and new source review permitting for best available control technology are now captured because of their carbon footprint. I serve on the Bay Area AQ&B's advisory board, and I was talking with staff recently to try to get a feel for, well, what is best available control technology? And that's anyone's guess, because when you think of controlling air emissions, you're trying to end up with more efficiency in the combustion process and more CO2 and H2O. So that is what the traditional focus has been for air pollution control for decades. Now we're trying to tackle a different issue, which is at odds with the approach. So it's really an unknown as to what that will be in terms of what is an effective best available control technology. Next slide addresses the evolution of the lower ambient air quality standards for smog or ground level ozone, which has dropped over the years from the prior to Clinton, during the Clinton administration, then the W. Bush administration, dropping from 112 parts per million down to 75 parts per million. And we were on track for the administration in Washington to lower it further to below 70 parts per million. But being an election year, as Eric mentioned, a lot of things are up on hold, and it's distinctly possible that the brake will be released in November, and the EPA will move forward on lowering the ambient air quality standard further for smog. Well, what does that mean? If you perhaps can see the next slide, you would see that the number of shaded areas that are considered non-attainment will grow and will include 345 new counties that would move from attainment, meeting the healthful standards, to non-attainment, exceeding the standards, which would then have impacts on air permitting at the local level. Next slide. This is Senate Bill 739, which is in my article. And if anyone wants a copy of the article, I've got about 10 or 15 of them up here, so feel free to drop by after I finish. So Senate Bill 739 is a bill that was approved, became effective January 1st, requires the Port of Oakland, Long Beach, and Los Angeles to assess their infrastructural needs, as well as air permitting or air improvement projects as well. So it's an infrastructural bill that requires the ports to assess the needs, report them to the state legislature by July 1st of this year, which I presume will queue up the possibility of finding funding and or shifting attention to infrastructure at the port level. Next slide deals with an ARB program that really ensnared a lot of companies, and it was off the radar, dealing with the requirement for large trucks, diesel trucks of 6,000 pounds or larger gross vehicle weight were required to do two things. They're required to measure their tailpipe emissions with respect to opacity and not exceed a certain limit. And it turned out that a number of companies were being hit with 5 and 6 and 7-figure penalties. The legislature a couple of years ago passed a new rule that calls for the equivalent of a smog check for diesel trucks. So with the approval of that program, that obviated the opacity program for about 77,000 trucks that are suddenly no longer captured by this ARB requirement. But it still applies to those trucks larger than 14,000 pounds gross vehicle weight. In energy, we saw a number of developments, way too many to cover here, but the ones that are relevant would be AB 631, and this basically allows Maritime and other businesses to develop the infrastructure to support plug-in hybrid technologies for your trucks and cars for employees and for business purposes, and they can do so without having to be regulated as a public utility. SBX 1.2 is that would be the second bill in the first extraordinary session of the new administration, and that called for expanding the reach of the renewable portfolio standard for the major utilities in California, moving the standard from 20% renewables by 2010 to 33% renewables by the year 2020. That will have a significant impact on indirectly impacting climate change footprint in California. My colleagues, some of who are here, are on the State Board Legislation Committee, and we met with the Senate and Assembly leaders recently in the Capitol to get a feel for where things are going in the future. And one of the members spoke about the possibility of AB 32 having a 50,000-mile checkup. So when it was enacted in 2006, there was a view towards the strategy, but what has emerged in the meantime is the advance in the renewable portfolio standards and the adoption of the new car standards so that newer vehicles are going to be that much more fuel efficient. So the vision as of 2006 has shifted because other progress that has been made on climate change. So we may see AB 32 getting a second look in the next year or two. Next slide deals with the newly established green building standards. Now, everyone probably knows about the voluntary standard for LEED, which helps or encourages architectural design and also community planning. Well, California adopted its own standards known as the Green Building Standards, and they will be enforced at the local level by building departments, and they're mandatory for new construction as of now. So it's not a voluntary standard like LEED, it's mandatory. So as you're planning new projects, you want to be incorporating these green building standards, which among other things are focused on reducing water footprint, recycling construction debris, lower VOC carpets and paints, and performing mandatory inspections of energy and mechanical systems for large buildings of a certain size to ensure efficiency in energy consumption and lowering the carbon footprint. Next slide deals with hazardous waste. The treated waste wood standards, which deal with impregnated pesticides in wood, whether it's telephone poles with copper chromated arsenic or pentachlorophenol. It also deals with other treated wood that you want to have last for a while, which would be pallets. So lots of pallets and ports. So the treated waste wood standards are a strategy to relax the hazardous waste cradle to grave requirements, which are quite rigorous, as many of you know, and it gives a more abbreviated cradle-to-grave pathway for the treated waste wood. It still cannot be managed as a non-hazardous solid waste, but it must be managed in accordance with other accumulation hold times, bills of lading, labeling, training, and other kinds of requirements. Next slide is AB 1112 by Bay Area legislator Jared Huffman, dealing with a requirement that there be a screening mechanism for monitoring and inspecting the lightering and bunkering of fuel and lubricating oil. So, lightering is dealing with the transfer of oil as cargo, and bunkering dealing with moving lubricating oils and fuel from one vessel to another. Because of the risk over waters, there's now a strategy, according to this legislation, to screen those operations that present the highest risk, and then to increase monitoring and inspections for those that are identified in that regard. And the Coast Guard is a partner in this program. Next slide deals with the legislature's focus on the water bond, which was going to be on the 2010 ballot. But when the legislature thought about this years earlier, we had no idea we were going to face the Great Recession that still plagues us. So they pulled the bond from 2010, knowing that there would not be appetite to pass, to place a ballot on the initiative, and the voters would probably vote it down. So the plan at the moment is for it to be on the 2012 November ballot this year, though because it's $11 billion and affects all kinds of water supply, water quality projects, the expectation is that it's too heavy. It's going to cost too much and won't succeed. So there's a lot of discussion about how do we shrink the bond, or do they postpone it? And that remains to be seen. Next slide deals with the oil management program under the Clean Water Act, which is the Spill Prevention Control Countermeasure Program, which has been under change since 2002, but the rules were held in abeyance until November of this last year. It now applies across the board after a long wait. So those of you that have new construction, new activities, storing oil fuels of 1,320 gallons are now required for new projects to have your spill prevention control countermeasure SPCC plans in place before you turn dirt, or at least before you operate, let's say. And so those rules have finally found a stable spot. Next slide deals with some other water quality developments. SB 1284 relaxed the mandatory minimum penalty of $3,000 for serious violation that has been in place and still is, but the difference is that there is now a modest exemption for violations that involve a failure to submit a discharge monitoring report that does not result in any chemical release to waterways. And the discharger must demonstrate or explain away why they failed to complete the paperwork. If they meet those obligations, then they can avoid a serious mandatory $3,000 penalty per violation. The State Water Resources Control Board was recently ordered to suspend the numeric and pH limits on the new stormwater construction permit by Judge Connolly, who, by the way, I interned with in the legislature. He's now a judge, and he evaluated the new stormwater standards, and now they're suspended at least for the time being. Another development deals with the approval of the largest no sewage coastal zone in the U.S., 3 miles out, affecting pretty much much of the California coastline. And this involves ocean-going vessels of 300 tons or larger. Next slide deals with 2 issues, sustainability and solid waste. The legislature passed a bill that ups the ante and requires that there be a 75% diversion rate from non-hazardous solid waste from landfills. The rule up until very recently has been a 50% goal statewide, and that has been very successful. The statewide number has been roughly 60+% diversion from a 1990 level, which means that we've really done a considerably good job of reducing solid waste through recycling, source separation, composting, and so on. But that's, for the most part, been a residential focus. Now the focus will be on businesses. So businesses of a certain size will have to develop or work in a cooperative way to have a commercial recycling program. Take the commercial residential curbside recycling and expand that concept to businesses. So you'll need to be thinking about that in terms of planning. And then finally, in this topic, sustainability, there's a new standard by the Underwriters Laboratory, ULE, Underwriters Laboratory E for Environment, 880, which is a new standard for those of you focusing on sustainability. People can claim sustainable performance, but how do you police or validate whether someone's greenwashing or just doing some marketing? So the ULE 880 is a very robust standard, actually developed by greenbiz.org here in Oakland, and in partnership with the Underwriters Lab. And it quantifies how green is green, what the numbers look like for energy, decarbonization, dewatering, dematerialization, and a whole range of things. So you may want to keep an eye on that. Let's move ahead. Okay, let me just close with reference to, let's move up 2 slides to Slipup. AB 900 was enacted, and it will streamline the CEQA review at the appellate level. So instead of the district court, the appellate court will review a CEQA challenge de novo for the first time for big projects known as environmental leadership projects that meet certain criteria of being a green project. I'll close with the very second to last slide by pointing out that US EPA has the largest enforcement budget in US history, which allowed them to hire investigators and enforcement folks. And just because we're here in California does not mean that the EPA has rested on its delegation to the Cal EPA agencies. They are working with their own budgets to move forward on Region 9 enforcement. So with that, I will welcome any questions and thank you for the opportunity here.
Does anybody have a blue card for a question? Mary, could you John, mention how the bill to expedite environmental legislation got challenged this week?
I don't know anything about it.
I think it was filed either yesterday or the day before by the Planning and Conservation League to vacate the bill that you just talked about.
Oh, no.
Yes.
while you're formulating questions, here's copies of the article on new legislation with a lot more detail. If you want a copy, just come up and see it.
What is the biggest regulatory effect for the maritime industry as you see it next year?
I think the biggest issue, not just for maritime, but for all businesses, is really getting your hands around climate change strategies to reduce the carbon footprint. And the benefit, of course, is that it helps you save on costs because less fuel and so on, and less of an impact from an air quality standpoint. So in my experience, I've seen businesses focus on energy. And even today in the news, the governor passed an executive order that is focusing in on government buildings, which represent 100 million square feet of space. The second buildings are the second largest source of greenhouse gases in the state. And so the goal is to focus on zero net energy by the year 2020 for those buildings. So there are opportunities for everyone in the room, whether it's designing or retrofitting buildings with more energy efficiency strategies and systems, to how we move goods in electric vehicles and cold ironing and all those strategies. So at the end of the day, I think climate change is not only an issue for next year, but I think for decades to come.
One last question. We've been in a recession, if not slight depression, for the last several years. Do the regulatory agencies acknowledge the fact that we need to do some streamlining in order to be able to have business operate, in order to produce jobs, and then produce taxable income, to be able to operate those agencies in local government?
So the question is addressing whether the enforcement and implementing side of state agencies is focusing in on streamlining. I would say I was in Fresno 2 days ago, and I led a 2-hour talk on the issue of chemical release reporting. And one of our clients was found liable for not reporting the chemical release in a timely way. You may know that Kinder Morgan was fined $5 million for not reporting immediately. They reported at the end of the day. And so our client was in Kinder Morgan, but the client basically, instead of paying a penalty, the Fresno County supervisor for the Coupa said, why don't you fund a workshop on educating people on the importance of these rules and requirements. And so we had 90 people in the room, and instead of paying a penalty, they educated people. So at least anecdotally, I think, and others may agree, there's a sensitivity, because I think regulators, not all, but some really do get the fact that it needs to be a partnership, and I think that's an example of how it can happen.
Gary, thank you very much. And his environmental law reporter will be available either with Gary or at the very back.